As I was locking up my door to head to work, I noticed my neighbor across the way doing the same. It was a middle-aged woman who appeared to be overly exhausted. Heavy bags underneath her eyelids told a story of many sleepless nights. I playfully asked if she had a long night, which alerted her to my presence. I should mention that this woman and I hadn't officially met yet. We both happened to live across one another in this apartment complex. During our time there, we had seen each other a handful of times, something which is bound to happen if you live in apartments. We never shared a conversation longer than a simple greeting to one another. Usually, I'd just give her a disarming nod and she'd return a warm smile. She turned to face me with an expression like she had just seen a ghost. She clearly hadn't been aware of my presence, even though we were fairly close to one another. After a few awkward seconds, she shook her head and apologized, stating she hadn't been getting a lot of sleep lately. I could tell my joke landed flat, so I elected to end the brief conversation by wishing her well and telling her I hope she had a better night tonight. She thanked me, and just before I turned to descend the steps nearby, she stopped me. The woman apologized once more and asked if she could ask me a somewhat odd question. I looked about briefly and told her to go ahead. She asked me if I had heard any strange sounds around the apartment complex. I tilted my head back in thought before asking her what type of strange sounds. I could sense she was being nervous with this topic for some reason. She held a momentary pause before whispering, "The clicking." I curled my lips in thought, before shaking my head saying that I hadn't heard any clicking. She gave a defeated sigh before pushing past me down the steps. This was such an odd way to start the day, I thought to myself, as I took a moment to let her increase the distance between us before heading downstairs myself. As I drove to work, I pondered what she meant by clicking. Perhaps there was a rodent problem plaguing the complex, or maybe another neighbor making odd noises throughout the night. It only took a few hours of work for that bizarre encounter to slip to the far reaches of my mind. Days steadily turned into weeks, and I hadn't paid any more mind to my neighbor. That was until I was arriving home early one evening from work, to the sight of movers bringing in box after box into the apartment across from me. That woman's apartment. I saw a young couple standing outside watching the movers grab the boxes and lug them inside. I squeezed past the movers and arrived at my doorstep. I glanced behind me and saw that the entire apartment was vacant, aside from the boxes that they were stacking inside. I thought it was strange that the woman who I had spoken with only a couple weeks ago had suddenly moved out without my knowledge. I've lived in apartments for quite a long time, and you can definitely tell when someone is moving in or out, just by the sound alone, especially if they live adjacent to you. I made my way inside and shut my door. That night was filled with restless sleep. I found myself stirring from my bed multiple times throughout the night. My eyes would randomly, suddenly, snap open to the darkened interior of my apartment. I'd look around frantically for a few seconds, before realizing where I was and what was happening. There would be nothing there, of course, and after a brief pause to get my bearings, I'd drift back off to sleep. The following night, however, is when I finally started to hear it. A strange clicking noise. I was lying in bed watching some late-night TV, when this chittering slowly began to overtake the sound from the TV. I muted the volume and listened. The noise seemed to vanish almost entirely. I couldn't seem to pinpoint the source, but I found myself thinking back to the woman in the apartment next to me. I shut off my TV and tried to put the strange occurrence out of my mind. I rolled over in my bed and felt my consciousness drift away. It felt like mere seconds before I was jolted back awake, but I could tell it was already the middle of the night. I sat up, rubbing away the sleep from my eyes. I looked around and found nothing out of place. Then, after a few seconds, I started to hear that clicking noise again. It sounded organic, like an animal was creating the sound. I thought my previous assumption of a rodent problem was the correct one. I was about to force myself to go back to sleep when I heard the noise begin to move. That's when I noticed that the noise was coming from outside my apartment. My bedroom window was near my bed and it had a sprawling outlook on the apartment's courtyard. I drug my body out of bed and slumped over to the window. My curiosity was begging to be sated. I peeled back one of the curtains and looked out into the darkened courtyard. It took only a few moments for my eyes to adjust to the surroundings. I spotted the few dark trees that dotted the courtyard first. As my vision became clearer, I scanned around looking for any sign of an animal making that clicking noise. I couldn't make out anything moving around near my window. Then I froze. I spotted something very unsettling outside. It was plain as day, and I was surprised I hadn't spotted it immediately. There was a person standing in the field, like a statue. Actually, it looked exactly like a statue. It wasn't wearing any type of clothing, just had this pale gray skin that seemed to almost shimmer in the moonlight. But I knew for a fact that there were no statues in the courtyard. I'd lived here for over a year and a half, and I walk by that area every morning and night. There have never been any statues in the courtyard. I waited to see if this was where the sound was coming from. A moment passed, and I blinked my eyes. When I opened them, that statue-like person was gone. I could no longer hear the clicking sound, and I chalked this whole bout of insanity to my ever-growing fatigue. I crawled back into bed after double-checking to make sure my window was tightly fastened. 2 nights passed without further incident. Periodically, I thought I had heard that dreadful clicking noise, but ended up convinced that it was just my imagination. Then, last night, that sound returned, and with it came a lifetime of nightmares. I'd gotten off from work rather late in the evening. I pulled into the complex's parking lot and slung my bag loosely as I walked towards my apartment. When I did, I made sure to keep an eye on the courtyard as I passed by it, a habit which I had gotten into the previous 2 days. I ascended the steps and entered my door. After making a small TV dinner, I slouched on my couch in the living room. I turned on my TV and blinked my eyes a few times. When I opened them again, my TV was a dull blue screen, and I realized that I had fallen asleep. I turned off the TV, and that's when I felt my blood run cold. I could hear that clicking sound, far louder this time than any time previously. I quickly realized why it was far louder. The noise was coming from down my hallway to my bedroom. I quietly peeled myself from my couch and stood at the entrance to my hallway. I could see my darkened bedroom door slightly ajar at the end of the hall. I began to think I was having some extremely vivid nightmare. Then, my bedroom door started to creak open. Standing in the doorframe was that same figure I had spotted in the courtyard. Its gray, shimmering skin, its narrow, slender build. It held its arms to its side, almost like it was standing at attention. Its legs remained rigid as well. Its head, however, was tilted all the way back. I could only see its neck and the bottom of its chin. It croaked out that incessant clicking as it stood only a few feet away. In a flash, this thing drifted towards me, stopping abruptly in front of me. It felt like a train was about to hit me, and if I wasn't so petrified, I probably would have flinched backwards. peeled its arms away from its side, almost like it was gesturing for a hug. Then its neck began to pop and snap, nearly replacing that guttural clicking sound. Its head snapped down to face me, and I felt the color in my face drain away. It had a completely smooth, bald head. Black veins stretched up from its mouth to cover the top of its head. I couldn't see any eyes on its face, but I got the unwavering sense that it was staring directly at me. Then its mouth began to ooze this thick black liquid that dripped down onto its nearly flawless gray skin. The clicking grew to a crescendo, and I collapsed to my knees, holding my ears in pain. After a few minutes, I opened my eyes and saw the light from the sun shining through my living room window. My alarm went off a few minutes later, letting me know I needed to get ready for work. I mindlessly grabbed my things, wanting nothing more than to get out of my apartment. As I was locking up my front door, I heard a small voice behind me, asking me if I had a rough night. I snapped around wide-eyed to see a young woman standing behind me across the way. She had a concerned yet caring look on her face. I just replied, something like that. She gave me a half smile and a nod before walking down the steps. Just before she could move out of earshot, I called out to her and asked her if she had heard any strange sounds in her apartment. She shook her head and asked what kind of sounds. Just then, the deja vu finally set in, and I realized that this was exactly like before. I told her to forget about it. Instead of going to work today, I spent the majority of the day looking for new apartments on the other side of the city. I don't know what that thing is, or where it came from, but I don't plan on sticking around this place to find out. If any of you out there live in apartments and hear strange clicking coming from outside, it's probably best to get out of town for a few days, or start looking for a new place to live.